Sunny day, sweeping the clouds away. On my way to where the air is sweet. Where the air is sweet.
In the 1940s, the early days of children's television, most shows were simply produced for comedic purposes and did little to spark a passion for education in children. While shows such as Mr. Rogers and Captain Kangaroo conveyed a positive message about the treatment of others, shows such as The Addams Family, Batman, and The Flintstones focused on mindless entertainment. They did little to prepare children for school. During the 1960s, expectations were bombarded by women's rights movements, tearing down images of family, work, and ideas concerning independence. In 1966, during a dinner party conversation hosted by Joan, Ganz, Cooney, these shows were challenged as an inefficient children's television programming, and the idea of a show that would soon break tremendous constraints was conceived. Led by the first female American television executive producer, Sesame Street became the first children's show aimed at helping inner-city kids with preschool education and the understanding of the world around them. Joan, Ganz, Cooney's creation of Sesame Street combined education and entertainment in children's television programming, thereby breaking down economic and socio-cultural constraints, which led to the instrumental and tangential growth in children and established Ganz Cooney as an unsung hero. Born November 30th, 1929 in Phoenix, Arizona, Joan Ganz Cooney was raised in an upper-class household. Ganz and her two eldest siblings were raised by parents whose focus was success. Attending North High School, Ganz was extremely active in the productions of school plays. She attended the all-girls Catholic Dominican College for a year before transferring to the University of Arizona in 1948. In 1951, Ganz moved on to Washington, D.C. to work as a clerk and typist at the State Department. Here, she was inspired by the Father James Keller's movement, whose mission was for everyone to use their God-given natural talents and to fulfill their purpose in life. At the age of 23, Ganz moved to New York City to pursue journalism. She became employed by David Sarnoff at RCA, then at NBC writing opera synopsis. Eventually, Ganz worked for the anthology series The U.S. Steel Hour at CBS. During this time, her interest in liberal democratic politics grew, and she joined a group of young literary writers and editors that collaborated at the apartment of Partisan Review editor William Phillips. One of her co-workers moved to an education television station. This intrigued Ganz. After WNDT became a commercial enterprise, Ganz applied for a position as a publicist. However, she was told that they only needed producers. Stating, "I can produce," Ganz got the job thanks to her political ties with her liberal-minded friends. Her new boss, Louis Friedman, put her to work for a series of major issue teach-ins titled Court of Reason. During this time, she produced a local Emmy-winning documentary, Poverty, Anti-Poverty, and the Poor. Her job at WNDT continued until in the winter of 1966, when Ganz Cooney hosted a small dinner party consisting of her husband, her boss Louis Friedman, and two friends, Lloyd and Mary Morissette. Conversation soon turned to the question of how could we use television to educate children. In the summer of 1967, Ganz Cooney took a leave of absence from WNDT. Using her connection with executive Lloyd Morissette and expenses funded by Carnegie, she traveled the U.S. and Canada. She interviewed child education experts and documented her research in an essay entitled The Potential Uses of Television in Preschool Education. This became the basis for the idea of the Children's Television Workshop Corporation. She tried to bring the idea of the TV show up with WNDT, yet they rejected her offer and in fact questioned her credentials. Ganz Cooney then made the move to Carnegie Corporations, where in May of 1967, Ganz Cooney and Morissette began to research deeper into ways to educate children, especially for poverty-stricken children raised in inner-city neighborhoods. 2 years later, the pair raised $8 million for Sesame Street and established a children's television workshop. As a female, many in the industry questioned Ganz Cooney's authority. They claimed she lacked experience in production management and high-level managerial experience, as well as little to no children's education experience. However, Ganz Cooney persevered and pushed her way to the top to become the first female American television executive director of the CTW in February of 1968, thereby smashing the glass ceiling as the female creator of the successful Sesame Street in the CTW Corporation. The first episode of Sesame Street aired on November 10, 1969, and in the first season, Sesame Street won 3 Emmys, a Peabody, and was featured in Time magazine. Sesame Street broke paradigms as the first children's show aimed to educate. Soon after its production, Sesame Street found itself in the spotlight. Children were captivated by Sesame Street and its unique cast of characters. Sesame Street challenged current children's shows, setting a precedent unlike any other. The setting was a street within the inner city. There was a Muppet living in a garbage can, a Muppet in a foster home, and a young Muppet living on the streets. Inner city children could relate, thereby illustrating that children would want to watch an educational show, thereby changing parents' attitudes towards the show. The first episodes were aimed to help preschoolers better understand the alphabet, numbers, colors, etc. As a result, American schools saw an increase of children excited by the ideas of learning as each episode was viewed. Characters such as Big Bird, Oscar the Grouch, the Cookie Monster, and Elmo became a staple in children's lives and helped them navigate difficult issues. Muppets set examples for children, helping them in their development. Parents found Sesame Street to be the best TV show focusing on children, so they changed their channels from Scooby-Doo and the Flintstones to the friendly imaginary street. Although the show is aimed at 3 to 5-year-olds, even younger children began watching it. Seeing these results, Ganz Cooney realized she could broaden the educational experiences for these children with her production. Joan Ganz Cooney and Sesame Street not only broke barriers through educational television, but also through tough conversations about real-life situations. Years later, after introducing many more characters and episodes, Sesame Street began tackling heavier topics in ways that children would understand. These topics included incarceration, drug abuse, cultural differences, death, racism, poverty, autism, and with the newest character introduced named Carly, a Muppet with parents getting help with addiction. These episodes were often inspired by the hardships that had occurred in Ganz Cooney's life. Her father's suicide led to many of her episodes on the topic of death, along with the episode on divorce, which was inspired by her own. In 1990, Ganz Cooney left her position to retire. Today, Joan Ganz Cooney watches Sesame Street continue her successful legacy. In 2007, an independent research facility aimed to learn more about children's educational growth and how to help the television show created a website in honor of Ganz Cooney. The website is entitled the Joan Ganz Cooney Center. The center strives to continue the mission of Sesame Street, which is to help kids continue to improve in school, not only educationally, but socially, culturally. Even with its success, Sesame Street experienced an economic major downturn in 2015 to the tune of an $11 million loss. This caused PBS to sever connections with Sesame Street. Fortunately, the show was rescued by HBO, where it continues today. Many research-based studies were conducted on Sesame Street showing an increase of kindergartners better understanding basic fundamentals. In 1970, Ganz Cooney recognized that only 19% of children went to preschool, while 36% watched the show. And while boys and African Americans were statistically seen as having the most room for academic improvement at early ages, all kids who watched Sesame Street were 16% less likely to be below average. Statistics show children's social skills and education improved while watching Sesame Street. In 2001, a study named the Recontact Study showed that children who watched Sesame Street had higher GPAs, were more creative, and showed better grades in science and English. Not only this, but the study found that boys who watched the show became less aggressive in high school, and girls became more involved in school overall. These statistics prove that Joan Ganz Cooney's inspiring and dedicated efforts to create Sesame Street produced long-lasting positive impacts on childhood education. In 2018, Sesame Street opened a theme park in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, which soon became the first certified autism center in the world and will soon be opening even more parks. Joan Ganz Cooney's legacy lives on today. And 50 years later, Sesame Street is still using their education and social skill building platform for good, as the company has been supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and finding ways to safely fight COVID-19. On May 30th, 2020, Sesame Street produced a coronavirus special called The ABCs of COVID-19, a CNN's Sesame Street town hall for kids and parents, where the show talked about the differences we would see in everyday life, from playdates to school, and ways to cope with our emotions during these times. Following George Floyd's death, Sesame Street produced a second town hall episode, explaining to kids why equality and love for all is so important, along with stating, "Racism has no place on our street, or any street."
Racism is when people treat other people unfairly because of the way they look or the color of their skin.
The color of their skin? Oh, Elmo doesn't understand, Daddy. Elmo has friends with different types of skin. Oh, and fur, too. Black, brown, pink, purple.
I know, Elmo, but not all streets are like Sesame Street.
To do to care for me and care for you. C means cover your face. Wear a mask in a public place.
On November 9th, 2019, Sesame Street was reminded of their to-be-continued success story with their 50th anniversary. Through Joan Ganz Cooney's hardships came impediments in which she successfully maneuvered through time after time. These obstacles prove vital to the overall accomplishments made by a woman with whom most people are not acquainted with, yet extensively recognize her body of work, Sesame Street. Her fierce determination in the face of those who doubted her abilities led to one of the most successful educational children's shows on television. Since 1969, Joan Ganz Cooney's triumphant creation of Sesame Street has positively improved the educational growth and lives of children, thereby establishing her place in history as a tireless advocate for children and a true unsung hero.
And I'll take your hand. I'll walk right by your side and help you understand.